brothers, sisters, and all friends, all who visited the church today. My name is Eugen. I'm one of the home group leaders here in the church. And I have a special privilege to preach today during the first sermon. I do not preach very often in English, so that's sort of a challenge for me. So I will appreciate if you can pray for me during the service, and so that God encourages our hearts to open and my tongue to move and pronounce English words correctly. Could you tell me if you got a booklet, a church booklet, when you came in the church today? Could you raise your hand if you got, or raise your booklets if you got one? Okay, we will have now the pens passed out for those who didn't have your pens with you, so you can take some notes during the sermon, because it's very important for us to take notes, to make notes when you listen to a sermon. That's a good exercise. It trains your brain. It puts something inside of your heart, not just so that you can not just hear it, but you can actually remember it in a better way. So, do we have my assistants here? Yes. So they are passing out the pens now. Okay, so we are going to talk about the Good Samaritan today. As you can see on the monitors, some graphics about this. And this is a very famous story which is recorded in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10. We will come to it a little bit just in a moment. But before that, I want to ask you just a very simple question. If you like jokes about the Jews, I'm not sure how many of them are in the American culture, but in the Russian culture there are a lot of jokes about Jews, and many of them just praise the Jews. They sort of bring up their intellect, their mind, their cleverness, their smartness, so they sort of praise them. And so one of the jokes, I like one of the jokes about them, which says, like, one of the people approached a Jew and asked him, is it true that a real Jew, when he is asked a question, he would respond with a question? And the Jew responds to him, why do you think so? So it's like, and probably you have seen this feature, or you have noticed this sort of behavior from the Jews. So, and Jesus was a real Jew. He was very smart, and he very often flipped upside down the expectations of people, either by telling a story instead of giving a direct answer to the question, or by asking another question in return. So, and this is what exactly happened in this story we're gonna study today. So let's open our Bible, or if you don't have a Bible, just look up at the screen. We're gonna read Luke chapter 10, starting with verse 25. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And he answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But he, desired to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So you can see now that Jesus doesn't give him a straight answer. He's starting to tell him a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So this is a story, this is the entire story about the Good Samaritan. And I think I need to give a little bit of historical overview. So the story Jesus tells is based on the real events. Because in most of the Bible translation it is called the parable of the Good Samaritan. But actually, based on the real events, it's highly possible that this was the real story which Jesus told, because the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notorious for its danger and difficulty, and was known as the Way of Blood. It was about 18 miles long from Jerusalem to Jericho, and there were several places which were pretty dangerous because the road started from Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was on the mountaintop, and when you go to Jericho, you basically go down all the way, and so it was a pretty steep way down to Jericho, and Jericho was located below sea level, very close to the Dead Sea. So it's the setting where the story took place, and it was notorious, as I said, for its danger. So it is very likely that this story happened in reality. So Jesus told it to the people and to this lawyer who asked Jesus this question. And obviously the story is not about the Good Samaritan, even though it's called like this in most of the Bibles, and our graphic says the same today. But actually the story is about compassion, as you can see, because 2 people who passed by him, they didn't take a look at him, or they didn't spend any minute with him taking care of his wounds. But the 3rd person, who was a Samaritan, he stopped by and he had compassion on him. So our subject today will be loving our neighbor means serving others with a heart of compassion and not self-justification. This lawyer who asked the question, he wanted to justify himself when he was asking the question about who is your neighbor. He wanted to self-justify. We will talk later about that in more detail. But what does the story tell us about compassion? And we can find in the story that it tells us 3 important criteria, or 3 important things about compassion. And the first thing is loving God and loving neighbor sums up the law. As you can see in the first verses of the story we have read today, is that Jesus basically confirmed the interpretation of the law which the lawyer gave him. So when we read it, we most likely immediately think that the question is about going to heaven when you die. But in the first century context, it was not about going to heaven. Remember that the Jews were expecting Messiah. They were expecting someone who will come to the earth, who will defeat the Romans, and who will establish eternal kingdom on the earth. So that was their belief, that was their expectation. So the actual meaning of the question of the lawyer was like, Jesus, tell me, how can I live forever on the earth? How can I be in your forever, in your eternal kingdom when Messiah comes? What shall I do to be able to achieve that moment, to be able to stay like that? And Jesus asked him the question in return, and he said, how do you think? What should you do? And he answered, and he said that you should love your God. That was the first part. You should love your God, and that's the next slide you will see now. And probably you know that the first 4 commandments talk about relations between a human and God. So the first 4 commandments talk about vertical relationship between humanity and God. So as you recall, they say about do not create any image, do not worship any image, do not have an idol and such. So, and they are about loving your God. The next thing which said the lawyer and which Jesus confirmed was that you should love your neighbor. And that's the rest of the 10 commandments, what they are about. They are about loving your neighbor. So, in fact, they answer the questions like, how should you relate to someone around you? Or, for example, what should be your attitude towards your parents, right? Or, for example, can you take your neighbor's property? What should you do if your neighbor or someone next to you has something better than you have? Or, for example, what about having an affair with someone who is not your spouse? Those questions were addressed in the rest 6 commandments. So the lawyer summed up them in the right way. He said, you should love your God and you should love your neighbor. That basically sums up the entire law. And the Jews figured a word to sum up and call people who are around you neighbors. Not just the person who lives next to you, but people who are around you, who have some relationship with you, they call them neighbors. And in fact, over time or over centuries, Pharisees and scribes started to believe and teach that your neighbors are righteous people only. They found some basis in the book of Psalms, and they said, well, you no longer have to love the people who are ungodly, who are not righteous. For example, you should not love people, or actually you should hate people who are ungodly. You should hate tax collectors, prostitutes, pagans, and of course, especially you need to hate Samaritans. Because the Samaritans were the enemies of God, as they believed. So they excluded a big portion of humanity from their relationship. They said that you don't need to love ungodly people. You need to love only righteous people. Instead of loving all people around them, they started to love only a very limited circle of people who did something good to them in return, their neighbors. So that was their understanding of neighborhood, if I can call it like this. So, and look at Jesus, how responded to him. He said, what is written in the law? How do you read it? So we already spoke a little bit about this. In other words, Jesus told him like, hey, you are the expert of the law. You tell me what is right. The lawyer gave him his interpretation or his explanation, and look what Jesus answered to him. He said, he basically congratulated the lawyer on giving the right answer. He said, yes, that's correct. Do this and you will live. And when we read it, we get an impression that Jesus basically promotes the law. He says, okay, yes, fulfill the law and you will live. And here is the catch. Here is a problem. You cannot fulfill the law. No one of us can fulfill the law as it is written in the Bible. So, and because we all are humans, we all are imperfect, we all have sins, we all sin every day, so we cannot fulfill the law as it should be. But it is very important to have love to God and your neighbor if you want to be in the kingdom of God. Life in God's kingdom is a life of love toward God and others. It would be impossible for someone to inherit God's kingdom and hate someone in God's kingdom. Can you imagine this? Friends, can you imagine that someone gets into heaven, but he hates his brother or he hates his neighbor, and he hates him for the entire eternity. So they stay in heaven and they hate each other. How can it be? There is no way for that. So, and therefore, God puts special attention on loving your God and loving your neighbor. Because our life on the earth is the preparation for heaven. So if we cannot love the people around us, we won't be able to love people in heaven, or those souls which will be around us in heaven. And the next thing which I want to point out is that you should not try to love yourself. This is something that is not stated in this verse. God paid attention to you should love your God and you should love your neighbor. But when some people read this passage, they say, hey, in fact, you also should love yourself. You probably have heard these expressions or these ideas from people around you. In fact, we have already enough love to ourselves. Did you ever think about this? We already have enough love to ourselves in us. And Bible confirms this by saying in Ephesians 5:29, we can read that for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. So this is something that is written in the Bible, and the bottom line of this phrase or this passage is that you already have enough love for yourself. Don't worry about that. Friends, this teaching that you should love yourself first is one of the greatest heresies in the modern Christian church. This is a humanism. This is a humanistic view. This is humanism penetrating the church. And if you know what humanism is about, I can just reiterate or repeat or give a little background to this. Is that humanism is a system of beliefs that that human is above everything, that human is superior, that human is the biggest value. That's what humanism is about. But church is not about human or humanity. Church is about God and living life which would fit into God's expectations. The church is about praising and exalting God. Like the church is about having big God and small people. But if you believe that you need to love yourself first, you're actually saying, no, we are about big people and small God. And this is not true. This is not correct. Do you know who is Natalie Grant, guys? You probably know. That's a pretty famous Christian singer. And I believe youth and teens know her. She has a song called In Better Hands. Pretty well-known songs. The chorus there is like, I'm strong, all because of you. I stand in awe of every mountain that you move, and so on and such. But the song starts with the words like this. I will read them. It's hard to stand on shifting sand. It's hard to shine in the shadows of the night. You can't be free if you don't reach for help. You can't love if you don't love yourself. And that's a very famous song, actually. I heard it multiple times on the Christian radio. But this is wrong. This is not something that is written in the Bible, that you should love yourself first. And actually, the teaching is about putting yourself first before everything. But Jesus, when he came on the earth, he put himself in the last place. Imagine what would have happened if Jesus put himself in the first place. Would he be able to suffer on the cross? Would he be able to take all the sins of all of the people on himself? No way. Never. Because he would have compassion to himself first. He would have had that compassion, but he did not have it. In fact, this is a satanic teaching. In fact, this is a demonic philosophy. And when we read the conversation which Jesus had with Peter in Matthew 16:21, We can read it now. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." This is what is humanism about. This is what Satan wants us to believe in. He wants us to put us in the first place. And in that case, we won't be able to have compassion on other people. We won't be able to show compassion as God wants us to show, because our self-being would be exalted. Our self-being will be in the first place in that case. So this story tells us loving our neighbor means serving others with a heart of compassion and not self-justification. If you want to self-justify yourself, you should not try to love your neighbor. And as I said in the beginning, we have three important criteria about compassion in this passage. So the first criteria, or the first thing, is loving God and loving neighbor sums up the entire law. And the second thing is loving our neighbor means showing compassion. We cannot love our neighbor if we do not show compassion. Let me give you some historical overview here as well. So the Samaritans were a mixed race. Their ancestors have been the Jews who were taken into exile by the Assyrians, and in exchange, the Assyrians brought other people and placed them on this land. They started marrying each other, these nations, and finally they got mixed with Gentiles. So when the rest of the Jews returned from exile, they did not want to associate with the Samaritans because they already had mixed with the Gentiles. They started worshiping idols. They started to worship on the Mount Gerizim there, which was in Samaria and which was in the contrary to the law, which said that you should worship only God on the special place which he will select, and that was Jerusalem's temple. So they tried to have nothing to do with the Samaritans. The Jews. And the Jews were Jesus' target audience. They listened to all the stories Jesus said, and in that time, the hatred between Samaritans and Jews went to such a degree that the Jews destroyed Samaritan's temple on Mount Gerizim. And in return, the Samaritans desecrated Jewish temple at Passover with human bones. That happened in the first decades of the first century. So the tensions between these two nations were pretty high. And we will see the map now on the screen, which shows where Samaria was located. I will try to. This is Judea. This is where Judea was. This is Galilee. This is another place where Jews lived and Israelites. And this is Samaria. So Samaria was sort of dividing the Jewish land into two parts. And when Jews wanted to travel from Judea to Galilee, they basically went to Jericho. So this is Jerusalem. This is Jericho. They went to Jericho. Then they crossed Jordan here. This is the river Jordan. This is where it goes. They crossed Jordan on the other side, and this is pagans' land. This is Gentiles living here. So they went by this land, they moved up to Galilee, then they crossed Jordan here back, and this is the way they arrived in Galilee. Because they didn't want to do anything to do with, they didn't want to have anything to do with Samaritans. That was the reason they did this journey, to avoid any contact with them and not to walk on their land at all. So that was the historic background for what Jesus was talking about. The Pharisees at that time, they did good to those only who did good to them. They were ready to show compassion who had shown compassion to them. The lawyer's question was about proving that their understanding of who their neighbors were was correct. Probably he had something in his mind like, okay, so Jesus confirmed that loving your God and loving your neighbor are two most important things. Okay, I'm fine with that. Let me double check if my understanding of who is my neighbor is, if it is correct. Okay, let me ask him this question. So he, as Bible tells us, that he wanted to justify himself, and that was the reason he asked that question. He wanted to say, I'm righteous enough because I do good to all of my neighbors. And as we see from the story, he was wrong. So our take from this passage or from this part of the story is that we should not love our neighbor if we want just to be good. That will be just self-righteousness. And we should not love our neighbor if you want just to be in the mainstream. Because everyone shows compassion to some people. Everyone donates money to some non-commercial organizations like non-profit organizations or some clubs who serve people in need. Okay, let me be part of that as well. Everyone donates here in the church. Okay, let me donate a couple of bucks, a few bucks in the bucket as well. So that's just the thinking to be in the mainstream. And Jesus says that no, it's not something that I want you to do. The mainstream in that society was to avoid the Samaritans. The mainstream said, do not stay on that road. If you go from Jerusalem to Jericho, do not stay on that road. It's dangerous. You should not waste any minute there helping another person. Just go, run. It's dangerous here. That was the main idea there. The mainstream says to us, mind your own business. Don't talk to other people if they are in danger. Why would you care about that? Mind your own business. And as we can see in the story, a priest and a Levite were both in the mainstream. They basically didn't want to spend any time helping this person, so they didn't stop there. They didn't waste the time by helping the guy who was robbed and he was beaten by the robbers. It was like, do not touch a person who might be dead or dying. Do not spend time where you are not paid for. Is it something appealing to us? Do not. Why would you get in the ministry if you are not paid for it? Why would you waste your time on that? Let other people deal with that. And that's something that tells us that we don't have enough compassion in our love, in our heart. Sometimes the mainstream says us, do not be exposed to danger. If you want to go on a mission, you will be in danger in some countries. If you want to help other people, you will be in danger. If you want to bring someone who you don't know in your house, you might be in danger as well. So if you want to show true compassion, you need to go against the mainstream. Stan Guthrie, and if you didn't hear about him, Stan is an editor-at-large of the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview and for Christianity Today. So he's a very well-known Christian author. And he said, the question Jesus asks here is not about defining or limiting who our neighbor is. It is about being a neighbor, even to those society would say we must avoid. That's what compassion is about, or that's what who your neighbor is about. The next thing we can take from this passage is that do love your neighbor to show compassion. And we can read this in verse 33, but a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and where he saw him, he had compassion. That was the actual reason why he stopped and why he spent the time with this person. In fact, he did not only spend the time with him to help him and to bind his wounds. He spent much more of his time and money by helping this person, as we have read already. So compassion is a key in this story. It tells us that loving our neighbor means serving others with a heart of compassion and not just self-justification. It shows us three important criteria. I want to repeat them again. The first criteria is loving God and loving neighbor sums up the law. The second one is loving our neighbor means showing compassion. And the third important criteria is loving our neighbor means going out of your comfort zone. Everyone wants to stay in our comfort zone. It's convenient. But going out of our comfort zone, the first thing here, it means asking right questions. The lawyer was asking a wrong question. His question was, who is my neighbor? And Jesus turned his question upside down and he said, no, to whom you can be a good neighbor. Not who is your neighbor, to whom you can be a good neighbor. So if we want to make a difference in our ministry, in our church, in our family, in our office, anywhere we are, the first thing is to start asking right questions. The second thing here, you need to call it like it is. You need to name it like it is. In this case, when the lawyer responded to Jesus' question, he said to the last question, you remember when Jesus said, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? That was the last question of Jesus. And the lawyer answered, the one who showed him mercy. You see, the lawyer didn't want to say the word Samaritan. He didn't want even to pronounce it, so he used a euphemism. He said, the one who showed compassion. Instead of saying yes, unfortunately, it was the Samaritan. So that was the reason, that was actually one of the reasons why he proved to be self-righteous. Probably he found himself in the category of the priest, in the society of the priest and the Levite from the story. If the lawyer were on that road, probably he would have behaved in the same way as those two people behaved. So his attitude would be the same. He would just say, okay, I'm in a hurry, I have my own business to do, I don't have any time, unfortunately, to spend with this person who is here. And only the Samaritan who was going down that road, he found the time to help. So it means calling it like it is. It's the answer how you can go out of your comfort zone and how you can make a difference. Compassion is not hiding the truth. Compassion is not telling white lies. You have heard this expression, right? White lie. Compassion is not when people hide true diagnosis from a terminally ill person. This is not what is compassion about. Compassion is saying truth even when it is unpleasant, even when you may hurt other people. But if you understand that if you tell them the truth will change their life, if you understand that if you tell them the truth, it will make a difference in their life, it will make them change their behavior, or it will make them get saved and do something about their life, it's worth it. It makes sense to show compassion as it is, to call it like it is. Compassion is interfering with someone's life when they think it's none of your business. Compassion is if you, If you see someone's doing something wrong, it is okay to come up to their parents or to that person himself or herself and let them know about the problem. That's what is compassion about. And we can show it in our circumstances. We can show it in our church. We can show it in our families, in our extended families. But in most cases, our culture says, our mainstream tells us, no, it's none of your business. Why would you care about that? You will hurt that person. Don't talk like that. It's rude. It's something else. And Jesus didn't care about being rude. Jesus didn't care about meeting the expectations people had about him. His purpose was different. His purpose was to establish and to preach kingdom of God. That should be our purpose as well. And last but not the least, it means going above and beyond for people around you. We can read again this passage from verse 34. He went to him, so this Samaritan went to the person who was laying on the ground and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Why would he do this? It's not just bound up the wounds. It's not just helping him. So he put him on his own donkey. He took him to the hospital. He spent an enormous amount of time he should not have spent with this person who was beaten. He took him to the hotel, and he gave his money to the host of this hotel, or to the owner of the hotel, and he told him, "Take care of him, and I will be coming back in a few days, and I will repay you if you spend more than the money I'm giving you now." Compassion tells us, or drives our heart to go an extra mile with someone where we should not do or where we should not go. Compassion drives you to spend your time on things which others would consider waste of time. That's what compassion is about. Compassion makes you donate your money to charities and give away more than your tithe. That is what compassion is about. Compassion means dropping off something you do and spend time with someone who is in urgent need of help. That's what compassion is about. So this brings my sermon to conclusion, and I just want to repeat our main theme of the sermon once again, of this story, that loving our neighbor means serving others with a heart of compassion and not self-justification. How can we see Jesus in this story? How does it point out to Jesus? It's very simple. Jesus was the one who stopped on the road, who spent additional time, who spent some time with the person who was beaten by the robbers. And we were in that position. And Jesus came on earth, and he took his time. He spent the time on this earth to help us and to make the difference in us and to save us. So God calls us to display the beauty of his compassion by showing compassion to others who are in need, to those people who are around us. And that's not only righteous people, it's not only people from our family, it's not people who did something good to us already. It's helping everyone around us, because all of them are our neighbors. May God bless us, and let's stand up and pray now, and this will conclude this sermon.